Well, hopefully we're live. Welcome to TPW's first ever inaugural videocast, or some might say vodcast. We're still undecided. Please bear with us. It is our first time live on LinkedIn, and certainly I, for one, find the technical side of things a little bit nerve-wracking. If you're watching the recording, then I hope it's gone as seamlessly as we want it to. So first up in this series is Messaging Mastery. And this podcast is for you if you'd like to understand more about why messaging really matters, how to avoid common mistakes and pitfalls when crafting your key messages, or if you just need help moving from the beige to the more standout types of messaging. And to help me unravel exactly that is Vanessa Cuddeford. And thank you so much for joining, Vanessa. Good morning.
Pleasure. Really exciting to be doing this. This is my first LinkedIn Live as well. And, I've done hundreds and thousands of hours of live television, but I think this is slightly more nerve-wracking, as you say, because of the kind of technical aspect. We're not quite sure if we're live on LinkedIn or not. So hopefully we are, and hopefully people can see us. But it's lovely to be here.
Well, yeah, we could just be talking to each other, but it'll be interesting nonetheless for us, if no one else. So Vanessa and I first met in the newsroom, and since then, Vanessa has gone on to become a strategic communications advisor, and she helps professionals speak more confidently and persuasively. So Vanessa, oh, and of course, messaging is a key component of that. So Vanessa, can you tell me a bit more about your expertise before we kick off?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you said it really. My background, like yours, is as a journalist. We met in the newsroom. I became a presenter for ITV and BBC News, had a bit of a crisis of confidence in that time and found myself becoming quite nervous when speaking on camera. Eventually got over that. But what I realized was that I wasn't alone. Yes, I might have been a TV presenter, but everybody has to speak publicly at work, whether they're giving presentations, whether they're speaking up in meetings. And a lot of people really struggle with it. Anywhere between 50 and 70% of people don't particularly like speaking in public. And so that then led me on to help particularly women who struggle with their speaking nerves. Part of that is self-confidence, but a lot of it is, as you say, really knowing that what you're saying is great, being really secure in your message, knowing that you're being persuasive. And if you know those things and you know how to do those things, then that just adds to your confidence more generally. So that's what I do now. I help individuals with their messaging and their speaking confidence, and businesses too, to really nail those messages to get the results they want.
Fantastic. And we are getting some comments in saying we are live, loud and clear. So that's brilliant. It's not just us two this morning. Because I'm seeing the comments, I can now say with confidence that people can add comments along the way if they have specific questions. We don't have tons of time. So if we don't get to those questions and comments, then we will do everything we can. We will be sure to answer them afterwards. So let's get on to the questions, the chat, the proper chat. Let's go straight to it. Messaging or key messages. They're such incredibly dull words, aren't they? But they are so incredibly important for all things to do with communications, be that confident or in your line of work, speaking confidently. And I'm starting with a real biggie here, but why is crafting standout messaging so very important for communications, be it for businesses or for individuals?
Well, simply there's just so much noise out there, isn't there? You can't move for information in this day and age, whether it's on social media, whether it's emails, whether it's newspapers, whether it's online, on the radio. And so we've got so many calls on our attention that if your message as a business isn't super clear the moment people see it, then they're simply going to bounce off. I think that's the first thing to say. And what I see is the mistakes that people make is that they talk often about the features of what they do rather than the benefits. One of my favorite TED Talks of all time is by Simon Sinek, and he talks about the importance of having a why, and that people buy into your why, and that then appeals to people's emotional brain. And we often think that we make decisions on information, but actually we don't. We make decisions on emotion, and then we justify with logic. And so in order to get a really good message, number one, it needs to be super duper clear. Immediately, you need to understand what that message is, but also it needs to appeal to people's emotions. And really, I would say that if you don't have your messages nailed, either as an individual or as a business, then you're wasting a huge opportunity, because it really is business critical. And I know that we've spoken about this, Tessa. Sometimes businesses will kind of want the copy out immediately, and they won't necessarily have thought about what their key messages are first. And that's, really business critical, and a real loss if you don't first do your thinking before you start putting your content out there.
Absolutely, and I like how you describe it as the why. And as you say, there is a bit of a tendency to pole vault over the why and straight on to kind of writing or the communications, and actually that will unravel as you go on, because if you haven't really sorted out the why, it's really blatantly obvious in all of your content and communications. Or worse still, your content and communications are just boring and they don't resonate or gain traction, which is horrible industry speak. And that really is a waste of time, but it's also a waste of money. Absolutely. And I really liked what you said about the emotional side of things. The emotional brain will definitely be going on to talk about that a bit further down the line. But what do you think are some of the, you've mentioned some of the sort of pitfalls and mistakes, but other ones, or those same ones in more details when crafting key messages? And it's important to note this is often inadvertent. Of course, it's not by any fault of anyone's or anyone's doing.
I think saying too much is a really big mistake. And when you're talking about your own business or what you do, you're so close to it, so much, all the detail, and you're often very passionate about it. So you want to get this across to people. And so we kind of tend to overload people with information and not just keep it really super duper simple. You and I as journalists know how difficult it is actually to be simple. And often you'll get a very complicated story, and a journalist's job is to make it easy and understandable for people who aren't experts in it, and kind of put a headline on it so that people can immediately understand what that story's about. Businesses need to do that for themselves as well. Far better to say one thing really clearly, really simply, so that everybody understands it, rather than overload them with information. Another problem that I see is that businesses make it about themselves. So they'll want to say, we've got 14 offices around the world, we won this award, we work with these clients. But your audience doesn't care about you. They only care about you in so much as you can help them. So what's the thing that you can do for them? What's the outcome that you can get them? And that's where you need to be putting your message. And really, it's features that you want to be emphasizing, rather benefits you want to be emphasizing, rather than features. So a feature is this car has an airbag. A benefit is this airbag saves your life. That's the difference. And people care about outcomes and what you can achieve for them. So that's another thing. And then the other thing that I see is people trying to be a bit too clever. So if your message requires really any cognitive effort on the part of the reader or the listener, they're just going to bounce off. As I said, we've got so many calls on our attention that we need it to be clear for people to get it immediately. If they're going to have to start sort of thinking about it and working it out, then you've lost them.
Yes, and actually on that note, there's also a tendency sometimes, isn't there, to talk in tongues, jargon. I do bang on about jargon a lot on a bit of a personal crusade. But there is sort of idiosyncratic business speak within organisations, and it's incredibly alienating. Now, you've mentioned about simplicity and clarity and trying not to be too clever. But there is, I think, a misconception perhaps that colloquial conversational messaging is dumbing down. Have you come across this?
Yeah. And, I particularly when I'm training people to speak in meetings, often they'll want to show that they know all the lingo and all the jargon because they think it makes them sound more intelligent. Actually, it's quite exclusive. And it's a real skill to be able to describe and talk about complicated ideas simply. And if you're speaking in a way that your 12-year-old niece or nephew wouldn't understand, or writing in a way that they wouldn't understand, then I think you're pitching it wrong. And there's a difference, isn't there, Tessa, between simple and simplistic. One of my favorite quotes of all time is by the French writer Paul Valéry, and he said, everything simple is false, but everything complicated is unusable. And what he meant by that is that, yes, you're never going to be able to get all the information across in one go. If you make it simple, it is to an extent going to be false because you can't get everything in there. But if you try to get everything in there, then it's unusable anyway. So you're going to have to slaughter your darlings and cut stuff out, painful though it may be. You've just got to accept it. There's a great book called The Thing Explainer by Randall Munro. And what that book does, it explains the workings of complicated bits of kit in very simple language. So it explains to you how a rocket works or how a dishwasher works, but it only uses the top 1,000 words in the English language. And I'm saying 1,000 because the word 1,000 isn't in the top most used 1,000 words in the English language. And what that book shows is how actually you can, using these simple words that a child would use, explain even these really complicated things. Now, if you're a business, of course, you're not just going to use 1,000 words to talk about what you do. But what I love about that book is that it gets you thinking, am I using jargon? Am I using words that people really need a dictionary to help them understand, or special expertise? And if I am, how can I pare it back? How can I make it more simple?
I love the expression "slaughter your darlings." I think I'm going to steal that one. And absolutely, for me, an more intelligent approach is being able to communicate with all your audience and not leaving them on the outside, if you like. You talked about the emotional brain, and emotion again is key, isn't it, Vanessa, when crafting messages? Let's talk a bit more about this. The EQ. I think sometimes this can be left out altogether in favour of, as you said, sort of things like innovative solutions, game-changing products and services. Would you say that strong messaging is all about the feel for those on the receiving end?
Yeah, Maya Angelou put it best, didn't she, when she said, people will forget what you say, forget what you do, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And again, back to that TED talk of Simon Sinek's, when he talks about why certain businesses succeed, it's because they give us a certain feeling. If you buy an Apple product, you're not buying widgets and sprockets and technical things, because all telephones, all bits of kit have that. You're buying that kind of culture and the kind of lifestyle it gives you, the fact that you can go anywhere and you can take photos and you can listen to your music and you've got a kind of little life in this bit of kit. It enables you to live a certain lifestyle. That's what you're buying into. If you look at any kind of advertising, if you're buying a sofa, that advert won't say we've got really strong arms and some great leather and a plumpy cushion. They'll kind of sell you again a feeling of coziness and time spent with the family. So they're selling you a feeling, and that's what we buy ultimately. So yeah, emotion is really key. And there are some really great examples when emotion has been more persuasive than the facts. So for example, if we think back to the London 2012 Olympic bid, that Olympic bid sort of should have gone to Paris. Paris was the shoe-in. It was assumed that Paris would win that bid. But when it came to that presentation to the IOC, Paris really majored on the logistics, the fact that they had lots of hotel rooms, they had all the transport infrastructure, they were very well set up for it. Whereas London really talked about the legacy and the feeling and the sporting feeling, and how this would be so great for London and all the generations to come, and it would really inspire them. And ultimately, at the last minute, that's why London picked Paris to the post, because they gave it all the feels and it worked.
Absolutely. And I have a not so exciting example, but perhaps relevant to my clients. I came across a fertilizer company recently, which is quite timely given the situation in Ukraine at the moment. And of course, they an agricultural company. They could talk about innovative, environmentally friendly solutions that would enhance crop yield or something. And I come across these kinds of messages quite a lot, actually. But instead, they say it's all about feeding the world and saving the planet. And it's very short, it's very succinct, it packs a punch, and it's all about the field. It's actually all about the field, because it's to do with an agricultural company, but it's all about the feel. And that's why it works so brilliantly. And I'd use that example when I'm talking to businesses time and time again. Yeah. It is, we're talking about it as if it's straightforward, though, aren't we? And it's not. And I think one of the reasons why it's not is because people are so in their day jobs, in their businesses, in the thick of it, they can't see the wood for the trees. It's really difficult to decipher. Sometimes I've had clients say, but we don't do anything exciting. And when you unravel it, it turns out actually they might have invented an entire financial product, and the rest of the industry followed them, but they can't see that. That's actually a real life example that I've had recently. So, what do you do? Do you think it's about having conversations and letting someone in from the outside and then unraveling what really matters?
100%. I mean, I would say that, wouldn't I? Because of what we do. But I think to get someone with a journalistic perspective as well, because that's why so many former journalists become comms people, because you're always looking for the story, aren't you? That's often buried in, line 53 of the press release, or perhaps is even trying to be hidden by an organization that doesn't want a certain element or line of the story to come out. And as a journalist, what you're doing is really searching for that, and you have that kind of sixth sense for what really is this story. And as you rightly say, if you're in it, if you're in that bubble, you know your content so well, this is just your everyday normal, you often can't see what that story and that interesting line is. So definitely getting an outside perspective. If you can't bring in that kind of journalistic figure, then certainly as a groupthink is really useful, isn't it? And just really, I suppose, having a brain dump and saying, right, what are all the things we do? What might be unusual about this? What might people not know about us? And trying to find a way in that way. And I think forcing yourself to ask the question, if I could only say one thing to these people, to this audience, what would that most impactful, exciting one thing be? And that really forces you, again, to get rid of all the kind of the what and the how. And again, I think it often gets you to the why. What's the most important thing that they need to know about you? And that is probably going to be your headline and your key message.
Absolutely. I did have a comment, if I was to be able to get them back up on my screen, about the why, if you just bear with me, everybody. Can you see that from Celia? Our why also helps us stay on track with our objectives. It's a lot easier to get lost in the woods if we are not clear what the key messages that are driving us are. Yeah. So absolutely. How am I going to get that off the screen? There we go. I've done it. This is all going very well. And actually, I suppose a funny thing, you'll get this, but as a journalist, when you interview people, it's that. And finally, sort of, have you got anything else to add, part of the interview, where suddenly all this interesting, juicy stuff comes out. And I find it's a bit like that when brainstorming key messages. You can have an hour's conversation and they're like, no, it's a bit like the hidden stuff that you're talking about. We don't really have anything exciting. No, we are actually really stable and boring. We don't have anything, that differentiates us, is a conversation I often have. And then just when you're about to wrap up the conversation, you say, so look, is there anything else to add? Is there anything we haven't talked about? It may not seem relevant, but can we just get it out there? And I often find that that's when you get the kind of the game changer, if you like, the hook, the angle, the hidden stuff suddenly comes out, and that becomes, absolutely vital for the key messaging. Do you have the same experience?
Totally. I mean, I can remember one occasion I was interviewing someone. He'd been, it was an old couple, he'd been a miner in Wales during the Second World War, and we were there essentially to find out his story. And then as his wife was making me a cup of tea afterwards, I said to her, and what did you do during the war? And she'd parachuted into France and worked as a spy. And here was arguably a much more interesting story, but she'd sort of just discounted that because we were there to talk about her husband. So yeah, that's I totally get it. It's in those little conversations afterwards when people just drop in these nuggets and you think, oh my God, that's the thing I want to find out about.
Actually, we have another question, if I can manage to do this again, from Ian. If you had to pick one, which corporate messaging do you particularly admire? Now, Vanessa, we've talked about looking beyond the obvious and the example of UNHCR. Could you tell a bit more about that, please?
Yeah, so this was, I worked with someone who worked for the UNHCR, United Nations, what does it stand for? High Commission for Refugees, I think it is. And so at the time they were trying to get support and donations for Syrian refugees. And what they found was that there was a lot of fatigue around that because the same sorts of campaigns had been running over and over, often with images, very, terrible images of children and people who'd been, who'd become refugees in Syria. But there was kind of a fatigue because people had seen a lot of that. And also perhaps it felt slightly alien and actually was playing on a lot of fears that people had at the time about the so-called migrant crisis in Europe. And so what the UNHCR did was that they really wanted to kind of turn that on its head and approach it in a completely different way. And they made this great video campaign called Would You Give Johannes Your Coat? And this was set in Norway. And what they did is they got a little boy in Norway to sit at a bus stop without a coat on in the snow. And then they just filmed what happened. And of course, strangers came and sat at this bus stop and they'd see him and they'd say to him, what's the matter? Are you on your own? They'd give him his coat, their coat, and they'd look after him. And it's a really emotional film, you watch that and you see all the best of humanity there looking after this little boy. And then at the end of it, they say simply, children in Syria don't have coats. Would you donate to help the children in Syria? And what was so great about that was that it was surprising. You didn't expect that to be a film about Syrian refugees. It was something that was relatable because this was going out to people in Norway. It was one of their own. It was a little child who needed help. They totally felt that and understood that. And of course, therefore, it was really emotional. You can't watch that film without it bringing a tear to your eye. So it had lots of those features that make messages really great, really sticky, really memorable. But it was a very different approach to the usual kind of images that you would use in a campaign like that.
Absolutely. And of course, some people would say, well, we don't have stories like that, but there are always emotional angles to the driest of subjects. And talking about that was, sorry
to interrupt you, but they created that. They set that up to make a point about actually how you would help your neighbor, and it highlighted something that perhaps people hadn't realized, that these Syrian refugees felt foreign to them, but actually when they brought it back into their home context, it felt very different. And so that wasn't a story that was happening. They created that in order to highlight that point.
Absolutely. But I think businesses, professionals can think that the imaginative side, that, the colourful aspect of messaging can be really hard sometimes, and they can't think creatively and imaginatively. I think we always say, try and say something unexpected. That throws people as well because they think they don't have anything unexpected to say. What would your advice be in this scenario?
There's a great book called Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath, brothers, and they talk about messaging, and this is essentially, what makes a message sticky and what makes a message have impact. And they come up with this acronym SUCCESS, the success formula. So it has to be surprising, first of all, unexpected, concrete, credible, emotional, stories. And if you can include, some, if not all of those, then you're going to be creating a good message. And surprising, it's going to depend on different contexts what surprising is. You don't have to be kind of coming up with something completely new, but perhaps starting from a less obvious point. I remember reading Margaret Atwood saying how to tell a good story, and she said, if you were telling the story of Little Red Riding Hood and you started with once upon a time there was a little girl, we'd all go, oh, boring, we've heard that story 100 times before. But if you start from the point of view that says, it was dark inside the wolf, you're taking people right into the middle of the action, and now we're intrigued. How she got inside the wolf? What's going on here? And so really it's the same story, but it's just starting from a surprising point. So thinking about that, how can I not necessarily tell this story from the beginning to the middle to the end, but come in at a different point that might be surprising? I think Donald Trump is a really good example of someone who was quite surprising in his messaging. And that's why he was so successful, because he would say things that people didn't expect and they couldn't quite understand in the moment. So when he said, we're going to build a wall and make Mexico pay for it, what? How does that add up? How the heck's Mexico going to pay for it? Now, that turned out not to be true. And obviously we want to be truthful in our messaging. But what he did was created that intrigue. He didn't quite resolve that in that moment. He didn't explain it all. And so he piqued people's interest, and now they want to find out more. But yeah, I really recommend that book, Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath, and the success formula gives some really great examples of how you can make things unexpected, how you can make things concrete, because often in business we're talking about abstract ideas and they're not very sticky and memorable. So how can you make those abstract ideas concrete in some way? How can you be emotional? How can you make sure it's credible? That key little fact or stat that's going to ensure that people really believe it is really important too. And of course, stories are always a great way to make messages sticky.
So we all need to channel our inner Trump then, is that what you're saying?
Maybe.
Now we're coming to the end really of the vodcast, but I was going to leave on this final question, which really is perfect to actually wrap up everything that we're saying succinctly. So, how do we ask ourselves as a business or an individual the right questions about finding the why? So, we've had a veritable smorgasbord of messaging tips, but if we're saying succinctly, just to end the vodcast, what are the three things that we'd say about businesses or professionals wanting to crack the messaging nut?
So speak to the benefit for your audience, not the feature. It's not the what you do, it's the why you do it. And really to find that out for yourself, again, look to your own values. Why did you join this organization? Why did you set up this company? You will have had a why. It's very easy to get stuck in the what and the figures and the day to day, isn't it? But ultimately, why did you want to do this thing? Most of us want to get some kind of benefit in that we want to add to the sum total of the world, help people in some way. That's your why. So there's that point. In terms of the kind of writing of your messages, use short Anglo-Saxon words. I think it was Winston Churchill who said the short words are the best words, the old words best of all. And basically, as you all know, Tessa, English is a mixture of Anglo-Saxon and Latin from when the French came over. If a word has more than 3 syllables, it's probably Latin derived rather than Anglo-Saxon derived. Day to day, we speak in Anglo-Saxon, so words of 1 to 2 syllables. If you're writing in kind of formal language, often legalistic language is Latin rather than Anglo-Saxon, and they'll use very long words. If you're writing in words with more than 3 syllables, then you're probably speaking in Latin. Go back to the drawing board and say, can I say this more simply in an old-fashioned Anglo-Saxon word? And then finally, less is more. Better to say one thing and it really cut through than say 5 things and it all just get lost.
Absolutely. And just to add to that we've said throughout the podcast, the feel, the emotion, the human side of your products and your services. Thank you so much, Vanessa. It's been fun and fascinating in equal measures for me, certainly. I hope I can say the same of our audience. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. Do get in touch, of course, if any comments, any questions that we haven't been able to cover. I'm sorry we've only managed 3, but we've got a short amount of time, but we will get back to you after the podcast, as I said at the beginning. Up next month in TPW's vodcast series is fine-tuning your tone of voice. So that'll be one to watch out for. I'll be sending out the details in a couple of weeks' time. So yes, thank you very much, Vanessa, and thanks to everybody for watching.